Laughter rippled among the crew, but Seraphina's chin lifted, her spine straightening with all the dignity drilled into her since childhood. She picked up the bread without lowering her gaze, tore a piece, and ate it as though it were served on porcelain at a king's table. The laughter faltered, for pride was a language even pirates understood. Still, fear gnawed at her heart. Each creak of the ship reminded her that she was alone in a world where no crown, no court, no father could reach her. The sea stretched endlessly, mercilessly, a horizon that mocked her longing for home. It was near midday when Kaelin descended from the helm. The deck hushed as he passed, men stepping aside with an obedience born of fear and loyalty. He stopped before her, casting a long shadow across her slight figure. "You'll have a cabin," he said simply. His voice was rough, as though shaped by years of wind and smoke, but it carried a calm authority that silenced even the ocean's roar. She blinked up at him, startled not by his words, but by the unexpected mercy within them. A cabin. Privacy. The barest shred of dignity amidst humiliation. Why? The word escaped her before she could bite it back. Kaelin's gaze lingered on her face, unreadable. "Because you are not cargo. Not yet. Not yet." The words sank like stones in her chest. She wanted to demand what he meant, to hurl her fear into his face and make him see that she was not some trinket to be traded. But the weight of his eyes silenced her, and she followed as he led her below deck. The cabin was small, its walls smelling of oak and tar, the single window no more than a slit for the sea's light. A narrow cot pressed against the wall, its blanket coarse but clean. Compared to the finery of the palace, it was a prison. Yet compared to the open deck and the mocking stares of his men, it was a sanctuary. Kaelin paused at the door as she stepped inside. "You'll be safe here," he said. His voice carried no warmth, but neither did it carry threat. Safe. She wanted to laugh. Nothing about her world was safe now. When the door closed, Seraphina sank onto the cot, her hands trembling in her lap. Alone, she let the tears come, silent at first, then harder, until her body shook with grief. She wept for the sailors who had died defending her, for the kingdom that would soon learn its princess was stolen, for the girl who had been told she was meant for crowns and alliances only to find herself a prisoner of pirates. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the grief, another feeling stirred. Not hope, not yet, but something she could not name. A pull, like the tide itself, drawing her toward a fate she had not chosen but could not escape. Days bled into nights, and Seraphina's world reshaped itself to the rhythm of the sea. She learned the sounds of the ship, the groan of timbers at dawn, the slap of ropes against the mast, the lull of waves when the wind slept. She ate coarse meals with the crew, enduring their curious stares until their jeers dulled to mutters. She listened, always listening, for whispers of what Kaelin intended for her. And she watched him. Captain Kaelin was no tyrant, nor was he merciful. He ruled his ship with a balance of steel and silence, his orders obeyed without question. He ate little, spoke less, and often stood at the prow long into the night, as though haunted by things the sea itself carried in its depths. Once, she caught him tending to a wounded sailor, binding the man's arm with a skill that spoke of long practice. Another time, she saw him place coins into the palm of a widow at a port, though he took nothing in return. He was feared, yes, but not without reason, and perhaps not without cause. The more she watched, the more the legend of the ruthless pirate began to blur. What remained was a man of shadows and secrets, and she could not help but wonder what storm had driven him from the world of men to live only upon the waves. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Seraphina stood on deck, the wind tugging at her unbound hair. She had thought herself alone until Kaelin's voice broke the silence. "Does the sea frighten you?" She turned to find him beside her, hands resting on the rail, his eyes on the endless horizon. "It swallows everything," she answered softly. "Ships, men, hope." He studied her, his expression unreadable. "It swallows, yes, but it also frees." She frowned, not understanding. Kaelin's gaze shifted back to the waves. "The sea has no kings, no crowns, only those bold enough to claim it. His words struck her like a chord in the dark. She thought of the palace halls where she had walked as a doll of diplomacy, of the marriage that awaited her in Veyrum, of the weight of a crown she had never wanted. And she realized, with a shiver she could not explain, that for the first time in her life, she was unmoored, unbound. The sea frightened her, yet it whispered too. And Captain Kalen, with his storm gray eyes and voice carved of steel and sorrow, was the voice of that whisper. That night, lying awake in her narrow cot, Seraphina pressed her mother's pendant to her chest. She had been stolen, yes. A prisoner. A bargaining piece. But something deeper told her that fate had not placed her here by accident. The sea had claimed her, and the sea, like the pirate who commanded it, did not return what it had taken. The black siren cut through the sea like a blade, carrying its stolen treasure not in gold or jewels, but in the form of a girl who had never been allowed to belong to herself. Seraphina had ceased to count the days since her capture. Aboard the pirate ship, time seemed measured not in hours but in tides, in sunsets that bled across the water, and moons that painted the deck silver. At first, she thought herself a caged bird, wings clipped and song silenced. Yet the longer she remained among the pirates, the more she felt the faintest stirring of feathers in her chest. The life she had known, gilded chambers, endless lessons in courtesy, whispers of treaties and alliances, seemed now like a distant dream. And though she despised herself for the thought, she began to dread the possibility of being ransomed back, her chains of silk waiting eagerly to receive her again. It was on a quiet evening, when the sea stretched calm and glassy beneath a reddening sky, that Kalen came to her with words that unsettled everything she thought she knew of her captivity. He found her at the rail, her hands resting lightly on the salt-worn wood, eyes fixed on the horizon. The breeze caught strands of her hair, tugging them across her face, and she did not turn as he approached. She had grown accustomed to his silent presence, to the way the crew parted before him like shadows before fire. "You've not asked when I'll ransom you," he said at last, his voice low, almost curious. Seraphina's lips pressed together before she answered, "What is the use? You will decide that, not I." For the first time, she thought she saw amusement flicker in his storm-gray eyes. "Perhaps. But the choice, Princess, is not as simple as you think." She turned toward him then, frowning. "Choice?" Kalen leaned against the rail, his gaze on the sea rather than her. "I could send word to your father. He would pay dearly to have his daughter returned. I could deliver you to Veyrum, see you wed to the prince who waits for you there, or—" He let the word hang like a blade suspended by a thread. "You could choose to walk a different shore." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Kalen said, his voice steady, "that you are no prisoner here unless you choose to be. The sea does not keep unwilling hearts. If you wish to go back to your gilded cage, I'll see you there. But if you wish—" He paused, finally meeting her gaze. "If you dare, the sea is yours. No crowns, no chains. Only freedom." Freedom. The word struck her harder than any cannon fire. She stared at him, searching his face for mockery, for cruelty. Yet his eyes were steady, unreadable, as though he offered her not temptation but truth. Her heart pounded. She thought of her father's stern voice, the heavy crown that had always loomed in her future, the prince she had never met who would claim her as his own. She thought of the palace halls where even her laughter had been measured. And then she thought of the sea, the wild, terrifying sea that had swallowed her life whole and yet left her standing, breathing, trembling. "You would let me go?" she whispered, scarcely believing. Kalen's mouth curved, not in a smile but something deeper, darker. "The sea takes what it wills. I only carry its gifts. What you do with them is not mine to command." For a long moment, she said nothing. The sound of the waves filled the silence, a lullaby and a warning all at once. Then, softly, she asked the question that had haunted her since the day she first saw him. "Why are you this way? Why turn from crowns and kingdoms to live as an outlaw of the waves?" Kalen's gaze grew distant, as though staring into waters only he could see. "Because once, I served a crown, and it betrayed me. He did not elaborate, but in the shadows of his eyes she glimpsed ghosts. A younger man, perhaps, with loyalty shattered, with dreams burned to ash. She wanted to ask more, to pry open the wound he carried so carefully hidden, but the air between them warned her that such truths were earned, not demanded. Instead, she whispered, I do not know how to be free. His eyes returned to hers, sharp as a storm breaking. Then perhaps it is time you learned. That night, she lay awake on her narrow cot, the sea's sway rocking her like a child. His words coiled in her mind, their promise and peril entwined. Freedom. A word that tasted both sweet and bitter. Could she truly turn her back on duty? On her people? On the vows her bloodline demanded? Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw not her father's crown, nor the Prince of Veyram, but Kaelin's gray eyes, steady as the tide, offering her a horizon she had never dared to imagine. The days that followed shifted subtly as though the entire ship leaned toward a new current. Kaelin gave her no orders, demanded nothing. He simply allowed her to move among the crew, to see the workings of the Black Siren. She learned the ropes, the sails, the songs of the men who had given their lives to the sea. She listened to their laughter, their curses, their stories of ports and storms and women loved and lost. Some regarded her with suspicion, others with a wary kind of respect. But slowly, grudgingly, she ceased to be only the princess. She became something else, an anomaly, a question, a possibility. One evening, as the crew hauled in their nets, Kaelin placed a dagger in her hand. She started, the weight cold against her palm. You'll need it, he said simply. I am no warrior, she murmured. His gaze hardened. Nor am I a nursemaid. If you choose the sea, you choose its dangers. Storms, hunger, men who would slit your throat for a coin. You learn to fight, or you don't live long. The blade trembled in her grasp, yet she held it, feeling its edge bite lightly against her skin. It was not a crown. It was not a jeweled scepter. It was something far more dangerous. For the first time in her life, Seraphina wondered if she could be something more than what she had been told to be. Weeks passed, and with them, the silence between princess and pirate began to fray. She caught glimpses of him in moments unguarded, mending a torn sail with patient hands, staring into the distance when he thought no one watched, the faintest trace of pain carved into his features like a scar time could not heal. And in those stolen glimpses, her heart betrayed her. The whispers began within her, soft, dangerous whispers of what it might mean to choose the sea, not because of freedom alone, but because of the man who had become its embodiment. Kaelin had offered her a choice. She knew it would come soon, sharp and final as a blade drawn, and when it did, her decision would bind her more tightly than any crown ever could. The sea had a way of softening edges, of wearing down even the sharpest stones until they became something altogether different. So it was with Seraphina. The longer she lived upon the Black Siren, the less she resembled the porcelain doll who had been carried aboard in silks and jewels. Her hair, once wound into braids of courtly perfection, now fell in waves salt-kissed by the wind. Her gowns, torn and ill-suited for the rigors of the sea, had been traded for a plain shirt and trousers that allowed her to climb the deck with a freedom she had never known. But it was not her garments alone that changed. It was her eyes. They no longer held only fear. There was a new light in them, fierce and alive, a reflection of horizons stretching endlessly beyond any kingdom's walls. And Kaelin noticed. He had meant his offer of freedom to be a test, a way to see if the princess would cling to her gilded fate or dare the uncharted waters of her own will. Yet as days turned to weeks, he found himself watching her with a vigilance that unsettled him. He had known many women in ports scattered like jewels across the coasts, women who had loved his danger, his legend, his fleeting presence. But Seraphina was not like them. She did not seek him. She challenged him simply by existing, by being both fragile and unyielding, both innocent and unafraid. He had seen her stand against the jeers of his crew with the dignity of a queen. He had seen her take a blade in hand, her knuckles white, yet her gaze steady. He had seen her laugh once, only once, when a sailor slipped on a coil of rope and cursed the sea with such dramatic flair that even the sky seemed to pause and listen. That laugh had struck him harder than cannon fire. It was dangerous, and Kalen knew danger better than any man alive. The crew, too, had begun to notice. Men whispered in dark corners, casting glances toward their captain and the princess. Some muttered of ill luck, of omens, for women aboard ships had long been seen as curses. Others spoke of opportunity. A royal hostage was worth more than a fleet of gold, provided she remained untouched. One night, as the moon laid a silver path across the waters, Seraphina overheard fragments of their unrest. "She softens him," one sailor grumbled. "The storm's gone from his eyes." "Aye," another muttered, sharpening a knife on stone. "If he loses his edge, we'll all be drowned men." Their words chilled her, though she walked past them with her chin high. It was one thing to be captive among pirates. It was another to be the cause of their suspicion, the crack that might splinter their loyalty. She began to withdraw, keeping to her cabin more often, venturing on deck only when she felt the safety of Kalen's shadow nearby. Yet even in retreat, her heart betrayed her. Each glance at him, each accidental brush of his hand against hers as he guided her grip on a rope or corrected her stance with the dagger, deepened the ache she could not admit. And Kalen felt it too. One evening, a storm brewed on the horizon, its thunder distant but promising. The air grew heavy, charged, and the crew worked swiftly to secure the sails. Seraphina, drawn by the tension, climbed to the deck despite the shouts urging her below. She found Kalen at the helm, his hair lashed by the wind, his eyes fixed on the dark line of clouds. "You should be inside," he said, his voice raised above the gusts. "And miss this?" She replied, breathless, the thrill of the tempest rising in her veins. "I have lived my whole life behind walls. I would rather face the storm." For the first time, he looked at her not as a prisoner, not as a princess, but as an equal standing beside him at the edge of the world. The storm broke with sudden violence, rain lashing, waves rising like mountains. The black siren pitched and groaned, her timbers shrieking in protest. Seraphina clung to the rail, the salt spray stinging her eyes, her heart pounding with terror and exhilaration. Kalen barked orders, his voice steady as steel, and the crew obeyed with frantic precision. A wave crashed over the deck, sweeping her from her footing. She cried out, thrown against the rail, her grip slipping. In that instant, Kalen was there, his hands seizing hers with unyielding strength, pulling her back from the jaws of the sea. For a heartbeat, they were pressed close, the storm raging around them, the world reduced to the thunder of waves and the thunder in her chest. His eyes met hers, gray lit with flashes of lightning, and she felt the truth she had feared and longed for in equal measure. The sea could take her life, but this man could take her soul. When the storm finally eased, dawn crept across a battered but unbroken ship. Exhaustion hung heavy on the crew, yet relief hummed in their laughter, their weary smiles. Seraphina sat on a coil of rope, drenched and shivering, but alive. Kalen approached her, silent for a long moment. Then he crouched before her, his gaze unreadable. "You risk too much," he said softly. She met his eyes, defiant. "And you risk nothing? You sail into storms as though you are their master." His lips curved faintly. "Storms I can master, but not you." The words, spoken so quietly, struck her like a confession. She felt heat rush to her cheeks, though the morning was cold. "Kalen," her voice faltered. She did not know what she had meant to say. Warning, plea, surrender. But the sound of his name upon her lips felt dangerous, intimate, a tether thrown into waters too deep. He rose abruptly, as though the closeness burned him. "Stay in your cabin," he said, more harshly than intended, before striding away. But that night she dreamed of the storm, not of the waves, nor the lightning, but of the moment his hand had held hers as though the sea itself could not tear them apart. The crew's whispers grew louder in the days that followed. Men eyed her with suspicion, muttered of curses, and one, emboldened by rum and discontent, went so far as to sneer at her openly. "Princess or not, she'll bring us to ruin." Kalen's reaction was swift, brutal. In a blur of motion, he slammed the man against the mast, his blade at the sailor's throat. Silence fell across the deck, the crew frozen as Kalen's voice cut through them like a blade. "She is under my protection," he growled. "Any man who touches her or questions her place answers to me." The sailor swallowed hard, nodding, and Kalen released him with a shove. The crew scattered like gulls before a storm, their loyalty cemented once more, though unease lingered in their eyes. Serafina watched from the shadows, her heart racing. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the tremor of something far more dangerous, an unspoken bond, a claim laid not in words of love, but in the language of fire and steel. Welcome to Aku'ul. Transform your text into high-quality speech in seconds. Just type your script here and click G. Kalen had staked his command, his very ship, upon her. And though no vow had passed between them, Serafina knew they were already bound. Bound not by chains, but by something far stronger and far more perilous. The sea had taught Serafina many things: how to balance on a swaying deck, how to read the moods of the wind, how to listen to silence as though it were a voice. But above all, it had taught her that freedom was not the absence of chains. It was the courage to bear the weight of one's choices. And now, that weight pressed upon her with a heaviness no storm could rival. It was Kalen who brought the news. They had anchored near a jagged isle, a place known only to smugglers and outlaws, where the cliffs rose like teeth from the sea and gulls wheeled endlessly overhead. The crew busied themselves with repairs, patching sails, and scrubbing the stains of battle from the deck. Serafina stood near the prow, watching the horizon, when Kalen approached, a sealed letter in his hand. "This was taken from a Veyrum vessel," he said, his voice quiet but sharp with meaning. "It bears the seal of your father's court." Her heart quickened as she broke the wax. The parchment smelled of home, of the ink and wax that had once surrounded her daily life. But the words it carried were nothing she had ever imagined. Althoria prepares for war. The message was terse, urgent. Veyrum accused the pirates of abducting the princess on her journey to wed their prince. Althoria denied responsibility but could not prevent the tide of accusation. Armies gathered on both sides, blades sharpening, treaties unraveling. The marriage that was meant to secure peace had instead sparked the flames of war. Serafina's vision blurred, the letters swimming before her eyes. War, because of her. Because she had been stolen from the path laid before her. She looked up at Kalen, the letter trembling in her hands. "This cannot be. There must be a way to stop it." "There is," he said grimly. "Return. Allow yourself to be delivered to Veyrum as promised. It will silence the accusations. The war will die before it begins." Her heart lurched. "And if I do not?" Kalen's gaze held hers, storm gray and unyielding. "Then kingdoms burn." The choice tore at her, body and soul. In her cabin, she paced like a caged creature, the letter clutched in her trembling fingers. Her father's stern voice echoed in her memory, commanding loyalty to crown and country. Her mother's softer whispers urged her to protect the people, to be their shield. How many lives hung upon her decision? Farmers, children, soldiers who would bleed for a cause they could not name. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she saw Kalen, his hand seizing hers in the storm. His voice steady and low, offering her freedom. His eyes shadows carved by betrayal, yet carrying a truth no crown could ever hold. He had given her a choice, but fate had turned that choice into a battlefield. Narrate to get started. That night, unable to rest, she sought him on deck. He stood at the rail, the moonlight carving his profile from silver and shadow. "If I return," she said softly, "I end a war. But I end myself as well." Kalen's jaw tightened, though he did not look at her. "You were never meant for me, princess. Your blood belongs to crowns, not to storms." She stepped closer, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "And if I do not return? If I stay?" At last he turned, and the weight of his gaze struck her like a wave. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then quietly he said, "Then you are mine, and the world will curse your name." The truth hung between them, stark and merciless. Love, or duty, freedom, or the lives of thousands. Her hands shook as she clutched her pendant. "Why would you give me this choice?" she whispered. Kaylin's voice was low, raw. "Because I have lived my life with no choices, and I would not see you bound the way I was." The days that followed were filled with silence, broken only by the endless rhythm of the waves. The crew sensed the storm within their captain, their eyes darting between him and the princess, whispers growing like weeds. Some muttered that she should be sold before she brought ruin upon them all. Others watched her with a kind of wary pity, as though she were a flame destined to consume everything she touched. Serafina tried to steel herself, to think only of duty, of the lives she might save. But when Kaylin passed near, when his hand brushed hers in the simplest of tasks, when his gaze lingered on her face as though he fought the same war she did, her resolve faltered. One evening, as the sun sank in a blaze of crimson, Kaylin sought her out. They stood apart from the crew, the sea whispering against the hull. "You must decide soon," he said. "I will not hold you here." Her throat ached with unshed tears. "If I return, I die in all but body. If I stay, others will die in truth." Kaylin's hand rose, hesitated, then touched her cheek, rough with calluses yet trembling faintly. "There is no choice without blood," he murmured. "The sea has taught me that." Her breath caught, and before she could stop herself, she leaned into his touch. His lips found hers in a kiss that was not gentle, not courtly, but desperate, like two souls clinging to one another in a world determined to tear them apart. For that moment, there were no crowns, no armies, no chains, only the salt of his mouth, the fire of his touch, the thunder of her heart as it broke and mended in the same breath. But when they parted, reality returned like a cruel tide. "We cannot have this," Kaylin said hoarsely. "Not without ruin." Tears glistened in her eyes. "And yet, we already do." That night, Serafina stood alone beneath the stars, the weight of her choice pressing upon her like the sea itself. She thought of her people, of the war that loomed. She thought of Kaylin, of the life he offered. A life untamed, dangerous, but hers. She had been raised to believe that sacrifice was the duty of queens. But what if her sacrifice was not her freedom, but her love? What if the greater cruelty was to return? The pendant at her throat gleamed faintly in the moonlight, as though her mother's voice still lingered within it. "Follow the truth of your heart, no matter the cost." And for the first time, Serafina wondered if the cost of peace was too high. At dawn, she found Kaylin once more at the helm. Her voice was steady, though her heart quaked. "I have made my choice," she said. His eyes searched hers, gray as the horizon, waiting. And though the words burned on her lips, she spoke them with all the courage the sea had given her. The dawn was pale. A veil of silver stretched across the restless sea. Mist curled low over the waves, softening the jagged line of the horizon, as though the world itself waited to see what choice she had made. Serafina stood at the helm beside Kaylin, her hair whipped by the wind, her eyes clear though rimmed with the shadows of sleepless nights. The letter from her father's court lay folded in her pocket, its inked warnings heavy as stone. Yet for the first time since she had boarded this ship as a prisoner, she felt no cage around her soul. "I will not return," she said. The words were quiet, but they struck like lightning. For a heartbeat, Kaylin did not move, did not breathe. His hands tightened on the wheel, his jaw rigid as though he fought the storm within. "Do you know what you choose?" His voice was low, edged with both wonder and dread. "Yes," she whispered. "I choose you. I choose the sea. Let kingdoms burn if they must, but I will not burn with them. My life is mine." The mist seemed to shiver, the waves to hush, as though the sea itself bore witness to her vow. Kaylin's hand reached for hers, rough and trembling. When their fingers closed together, it was as if an oath had been sworn not in ink and wax, but in salt and blood and fire. Yet fate is never still. Even as their hearts bound themselves, danger gathered on the horizon. The crew's mutters had ripened into anger. Men who had once followed Kaelin without question now saw their captain swayed by a woman, by a princess who brought the weight of kingdoms upon their backs. That afternoon, as the sun blazed high, the rebellion came. A shout rang out across the deck. Steel flashed. Half the crew turned their blades not against an enemy ship, but against their own captain. Seraphina was dragged back, her cries lost in the clash of cutlass against cutlass. Kaelin fought like the storm itself, his sword carving arcs of silver through the chaos. But they were many, and their rage was fed by fear. "Give her up," one bellowed. "She'll doom us all." Kaelin's reply was a roar, raw and unyielding. "She is mine to protect." Blood spattered the deck, the cries of men rising and falling like gulls in a tempest. Seraphina struggled against the grip of a sailor, her heart thundering. She had never felt so helpless, nor so certain of her choice. At last, Kaelin's blade struck true against the ringleader, felling him with a cry that silenced the rest. The rebels faltered, fear breaking their fury, and one by one they lowered their weapons. The deck reeked of salt and blood, but Kaelin still stood, chest heaving, eyes ablaze with something both savage and sacred. He turned to her, and in that moment, Seraphina saw not just the pirate feared across kingdoms, but the man who had laid his soul bare for her. But victory came at a cost. Another ship loomed on the horizon, its sails marked with the sigil of Veyrum. News of her capture had spread far and wide. The sea itself seemed to conspire to return her to her fate. The warship bore down upon them, cannons bristling, the wind swelling its sails like the wings of judgment. The crew, shaken and bloodied, cried out in despair. They could not outrun such a vessel, nor withstand its fire. Seraphina's pulse pounded. The moment of her choice had come again, sharper than before. "Kaelin," she whispered, clutching his arm. "They will not stop until I am theirs." His gaze held hers, gray and fierce. "Then let them come. I will fight until my last breath." But she shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. "If you fight, you die. If I go, perhaps you live. Perhaps the sea lives." He grasped her face between his hands, his touch desperate. "And what of us?" Her heart shattered even as she spoke. "We live in every wave, in every horizon. No kingdom can take that." Before he could stop her, she pulled the pendant from her neck, the last relic of her crown, her family, and pressed it into his palm. "Carry me with you," she whispered, "whatever comes." And then, before her courage could falter, she turned. She raised her voice so all could hear. "I will go." The warship drew alongside, its cannons primed. A boarding bridge was cast, and armored men swarmed across. Seraphina lifted her chin, her gown tattered, her hands still stained with salt and blood. Yet she looked every inch a princess, one who had chosen her fate. "I am Seraphina of Althoria," she declared. "Take me and spare them." The soldiers seized her, dragging her toward their ship. Kaelin lunged, but half a dozen blades barred his path. "Seraphina!" he roared, his voice breaking. She twisted in their grasp, her eyes locked on his one last time. "Remember me," she cried, her voice fierce with love. "Not as a princess, as yours." The bridge was pulled away, the ships parting once more. Kaelin's figure blurred through her tears, his face carved by anguish and fire. And then the cannon smoke swallowed her world. Legends say that Kaelin Blackthorn sailed the seas for years after, never captured, never tamed. Some say he bore a single pendant at his throat, worn smooth by the press of his hand. Others claim that on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the sea raged, his voice could be heard calling a name into the darkness. And as for Seraphina, she returned to her kingdom, her name bound forever to the peace that followed. Yet those who looked closely swore that her eyes were not the eyes of a queen, but of a woman who still gazed toward the horizon, as though her heart sailed there still. For love such as theirs could not be caged by crowns or seas. It lived eternal, boundless as the ocean itself. The pirate and the princess, forever chasing the horizon,